85% of firefighters reported low levels of confidence in handling and preserving evidence. 85% also stated that they'd received one-off training or never received training in either identifying or preserving forensic evidence.
It's not necessarily looking at what can be done better or picking fault with any current procedures. We're kind of focusing on that conversation that goes on at crime scenes. It's knowing the whole story, and I think that improves our methods and improves our understanding, and that's where good research comes from, is understanding the entire journey.
I loved the fire service, I loved everything about it, I loved the variety. It became more of a hobby than a job to me, if I'm honest with you.
Often in forensic science, processing all this potential evidence or whatever, and you don't even sometimes see the final verdict or anything like that. So it's everything in isolation, whereas good research comes from understanding and collaborating with lots of people. Understanding the impact, not just on the actual case or whatever you're working on, but on the individuals involved. 76%
of managers state that they have no confidence in effectively managing an incident from a forensic perspective.
That's a lot.
By nature, science, it progresses, it develops over time.
The number one finding for me was the fact that 100% said that at least one element of training would increase their awareness.
Hey everybody, welcome on back to the Firefighters Podcast. My guests today are James Sayer and Kat Maidman, and we are talking forensics on the front line. Now, James started his career in 2010 as a retained firefighter with Humberside Fire and Rescue, and served as an operational firefighter for 7 years before retraining as a paramedic at Sheffield Hallam University in 2017. Soon after graduating as a paramedic, he was offered a unique opportunity to complete a master's degree in forensic science at the University of Huddersfield, towards the end of which he undertook a research project for the forensic element of disaster victim identification, developing a plan to intertwine his academic interest with his previous experience to conduct what is believed to be the first ever firefighting paramedic-led emergency service forensic awareness research in the UK. This project is a collaboration between the University of Huddersfield and Professor Anna Williams at the University of Centre Lancashire and Lancashire Forensic Science Academy. So the research proposal was titled Assessing the Forensic Awareness of Fire and Ambulance Service Personnel when Attending Mass Fatality, Mass Casualty Incidents. Now, just so we break it down, and we're going to go into it in greater detail in the podcast, but this is a questionnaire of current fire service and paramedic personnel and their experiences handling potentially forensic evidence at mass fatality scenes. Now, it's worth mentioning at the time of recording this questionnaire is still live and ongoing and still available to complete, so you can find it in the link in the bottom of this podcast. If you look in the notes just below it, that's where it's going to be. Now, I am also joined by his project supervisor, Kat Maidment from the University of Huddersfield, who has been instrumental in supporting both the construction and delivery of this project. Kat was absolutely fascinating to spend time with. Now, she teaches on forensic science and covers a forensic anthropology specialism. I'm going to get all of these words wrong, so you'll have to forgive me if I do. She also teaches in other areas of forensic science, including forensic taphonomy. I'm sure I've got that wrong. Kat is also currently a PhD researcher at the University of Central Lancashire, researching the use of alternative light sources, that's ALS for short, to detect skeletal remains underwater. She has a BSc degree in death investigation from Teesside University and an MSc in forensic science from the University of Huddersfield. Alongside Kat's extensive academic record, she also has a significant laboratory and scientific experience working in a range of environments, including histology laboratories, a hospital mortuary, and a university setting. Now, we should also acknowledge once again Professor Anna Williams, who is not able to be with us today, but she's been a massive contributor to this work, and she is from the Lancashire Forensic Science Academy. Now, I was really interested to get these two on the podcast. I first met James at the Emergency Services show where he was conducting this questionnaire. He was getting out and about trying to get people to answer the questions and really trying to add to this pool of knowledge that we're going to hear about today. Something that's really distinct that I want us to take away is the awareness piece. So as we get into the conversation, it'll be a little bit clearer about what I'm saying when I say that, but my hope is that people take some real learnings away from this. Now, before we get into it with today's guest, let me tell you once again about an incredible company, William Wood Watches, creating those luxury British watch brands from upcycled fire service equipment. Now, if you haven't seen who these guys are, you've got to get over to williamwoodwatches.com. I was already an admirer and a fan of William Wood Watches long before the existence of the podcast. I learned of them through their support of the Firefighters charity, showing up at British Firefighter Challenges. When you jump over to the website, you'll see their Valiant collection, the Bronze edition, the Chivalrous collection, and new this year out was the Triumph collection. So for more information, head over to williamwoodwatches.com and check out their beautiful collection right now. Reflecting back after the recording of this episode, I felt personally like I had some significant CPD, after the end of the recording of this podcast. So my hope is that you're able to take one or two takeaways as well, and it's really going to empower you and encourage you to maybe go a little bit deeper. So all that's left to say is a big thanks to our partners and a big thanks to you to come back to the podcast. So if you are sitting comfortably, let's buckle up for safety, and I will see you folks on the other side.
And that's totally honest. Yeah. Are we happy?
Very.
Cat.
Of course you
I'm
are.
asking you. He's always happy. He's confident. He's all right. He's whatever. If you need a wee, if you want to, or anything like that. No, I'm joking. So, shall we kick off?
Let's do it.
James, Cat, welcome to the Firefighters Podcast. How are we doing?
Not bad, thanks. Thank you for having us.
Good, very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, mate. I'm feeling a little bit warm, to be honest. For everybody's information, we're sort of we've managed to put this together, and we've navigated all the crazy COVIDianness that it is. But it's so great when you're able to get in a room with people, even at distance, and share that conversation, because it makes it much richer. So thank you guys for doing that. During our intro, we've sort of gone into some of the aspects of why we're here today. But Kat, I wanted to start with yourself and talk about sort of the crux of what we're going to be getting into today. You have got so many different qualifications and degrees, but one of them is in death investigation. Now, how do you find that kind of works as a conversation starter, as a passion that you're interested in?
Well, I definitely don't tend to lead with that.
I imagine it'd be quite off-putting for some people.
Actually, it turns out to be quite a great conversation starter in a lot of ways, because either people are terrified and back away quite slowly, or they're super engaged and want to have ask you all these questions and get involved, and how did you get into it and all that kind of thing. And obviously I've built on my death investigation, so now I'm into forensic anthropology, so that's bones, and actually that's a little bit more kind of accessible to people.
Every time I sort of put for people's, if they're not sure, we kind of put briefs together before we have a chat. It's not scripted or anything like that, but it kind of helps me get a greater understanding so I can ask more in-depth stuff. And I started trying to look into some of the things, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to wait till Kat gets here, because I'm going down a rabbit hole of stuff I don't know anything about. So forensic science, or the study of forensics, is tremendously applicable to almost every field, but certainly, when we're speaking with James and myself, we kind of, and I'll say it on my behalf, I won't offend James, we kind of fumble around this world, and we forget the level of influence that we, in the world of emergency services operators, whether that be police, in all respect to the police, they're probably greater awareness of it, but fire service certainly, and ambulance, we can have a tremendous accidental influence in this. So I know it's something perhaps we're going to talk about later, but why do you think what we're going to talk about today is so relevant, and why people in the emergency services should maybe have a little bit better understanding of it?
First of all, we're kind of, with the research that we're going to have a chat about and what James has been looking into, it's not necessarily looking at what can be done better or picking fault with any current procedures or anything like that. We're kind of focusing on that kind of conversation that goes on at crime scenes. So at the moment, the impression we've got from the research is actually it is quite separate, and that's kind of what we're going to be looking into, is seeing what currently happens, and is increasing forensic awareness going to be advantageous or even interesting to people who are first responders, or is it something that's completely separate and they don't want anything to do with?
I think that I'm interested in your thoughts as well, James. Is I don't think it's that people would be. I've got my own bias because I'm relentlessly interested in lots of stuff. I don't want it to detract from our ability to do our jobs. Sometimes that paralysis of analysis where we worry too much. You don't want to get to a scene and people are like, don't touch anything, don't do anything. We're like, well, dude, it's still on fire. I've got to do something. I've got to eliminate the risk before we get any further. But there is a point, sort of a point of diminishing return, where you're like, if you continue to take action, you're not going to diminish the hazard or the risk. You're actually going to start causing damage or reducing the effectiveness of then that later forensic work. It's something I suppose I've had a little bit of information in when we look at fire investigation. So, Kat, when James proposed this subject as sort of a researched area, why did you think it was valuable given sort of James's background? And then we'll jump over and get into it.
Well, I think that's precisely why it was so interesting, because James has this really, really interesting, incredible background, this combination of paramedic experience and firefighter experience. And when he came to do forensics, we obviously have the kind of academic background and things like that. We just thought it would be really, really interesting to combine the two and have that conversation, be able to combine forensics and the practical aspects of crime scene, because from academia point of view, we don't always get to see that aspect. No. It's all a lot of theory and things like that. And
I always imagine that can be really, really frustrating. It's a little bit like for us sometimes, James, when you're involved in an incident and then the person leaves you and you don't get the background on where they go next and what happens to them. Some with yourself, I suppose, Kat, it's like you get delivered a load of information, you're asked to go into the depths of the bones and the intricacies of it, and then it disappears off into the ether again. Yeah. And if you kind of don't get that feedback, it's not like you want to know, did they whatever, did somebody go to jail, or did the person survive, or was this actually a fatality or anything like that. But if you don't get that, if you're not able to cross the bridge, sort of as you've been able to do with James, I imagine this has been quite surreal in knowing what it looks like when people first get there, and then kind of following it through the journey. If that makes sense.
It's knowing the whole story, and I think that kind of improves our methods and improves our understanding, and that's where good research comes from, is understanding the entire journey, like you said. So often in forensic science, you don't actually. You're processing all this potential evidence or whatever, and you don't even sometimes see the final verdict or anything like that. Yeah. So it's everything in isolation, whereas good research comes from understanding and collaborating with lots of people.
I always think of Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. But it speaks a lot about sort of the what, the why, and the how. And I always think so many people deal in the what and the how. But like you said there, if they don't have a conceptual, holistic understanding of the why, which is the step back look, sometimes it's harder to even engage with it remotely, because if we look at like somebody that works inside an organization in a very small aspect, they might just do the admin. And they're like, but before I did admin in an electric company, now I do admin in an insurance company. But if they don't see the why, and if they then went to do admin in like the Firefighters charity or something like that, they'd be like, well, this is a bigger why. And sometimes it motivates people to do it a little bit more. I suppose, like you say, if you understand the why as to what happened, why is it important, and where's it going, rather than just being told this is important, go and do the work, I suppose it's really going to give you, moving forward, it's going to give you a better look at it, I suppose.
Understanding the impact, not just on the actual case or whatever you're working on, but on the individuals involved.
No, I totally hear where you're coming from, because I always think of like, when you hear some of these people coming up with innovations for third world solutions, like somebody that has to carry water 1,000 miles on their head with one leg and no arms or something like that. And I say that with all due respect. If somebody is trying to find a solution to that, it's much more inspiring. James, we've jumped straight into something, and I always struggle with this. I digress straight into something. Just zoom us out for a second, with that sort of the intro that we did earlier in mind. When did you first join the fire service? When did you choose to turn your back on us and betray it? When did you then choose to turn over to the parent? And how did this whole sort of thing come about from your perspective, brother?
Yeah, good question. So I actually joined the fire service back in 2010. I started my career in the fire service as a firefighter. And I was quite unsure, actually, to start with where I wanted to go with my career. I was a little bit unsure. And I figured that if I did some time in the fire service, I was able to I saw it as a bit of a challenge initially, actually. If I could go through that training and get into that role, it would give me some really good skills, sort of physically, psychologically. I'd get a good grounding and then see where my career takes me from there. And actually, I found that I loved the fire service. I loved everything about it. I loved the variety. I loved, the fitness side of it. It became more of a hobby than a job to me, if I'm honest with you. But one thing that I noticed as sort of a few years went by is I was sort of itching for more progression. I wanted progression all the time. I was sort of hungry to do more all the time.
You're speaking to the choir, honestly.
I can get that. I
think deep down you're probably a bit of a serial addict. I'm an addict. I know if I don't have things to stimulate my mind, I get bloody mischievous.
This is it. I can relate. I can completely relate. And so I sort of, after a few years, maybe 5 or 6 years, I sort of reached a bit of a crossroads, and I thought, I'm sort of young enough now to still have another career in another area, and maybe take the skills that I've learned, that I've developed, and carry those sort of transferable skills from the fire service into another career. And I was always interested from day one in sort of the provision of pre-hospital medical care. So even as a firefighter in the earlier stages of training, delivering trauma care and going out to RTCs and dealing with patients, always had a real interest in that. And so at the time that I was sort of developing these ideas of maybe looking at the ambulance service or a career in healthcare, I was really fortunate that my employer in Humberside Fire and Rescue Service decided to get involved with or go into collaboration with Yorkshire Ambulance Service and start a sort of a medical emergency responder scheme.
I want to double click on that for a second, because we've had a bunch of people on from different countries, and this is not like a a job role conversation or anything like that. But when you look at what American fire services do and stuff like that, and I don't know the history of it, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but at some point in time, they seem to have been more receptive of being much more heavily involved in medical care and stuff like that. And I'm the same. My brother-in-law's a paramedic. I've done a bunch of ride-alongs. I really, really would wish that we did more. And I'm honest, I'm like a kid in the sweet shop. I would want to pick and choose. I want to go to the trauma. I don't want to go and sit in somebody's room testing their stool, you know, for 3 hours and then dropping them off at hospital. But I feel like if we were more receptive of the fact that a lot of people join the job because they want to make a difference, quote unquote, or they want to help people, which is great. But if we did just look at it as that why, then I think we would lose less people, and also we would get more people because it would allow that breadth of the role where you're able to do that. Why do you think, just as a sort of double click away from it for a second, why do you think we're a little bit more reluctant to that? I mean, dues to the people in Humberside allowing you to do that, but it's not necessarily something we see nationally.
Yeah, I think it came around really because of the need. I think really it's been driven by the pressure associated with ambulance services. So I think that's where it's initially come from. I think, it's driven by where we have a need and to, provision of service,
And we've seen that in the last 18 months as well. They've screamed out for it, and these incredibly resourceful people in the fire and emergency services have stood up and answered the call.
Yeah, and I think there's no getting away from the fact that ambulance services nationally are under enormous amounts of pressure and operational stress. And I think Humberside Fire and Rescue, I think we're very quick to say, well, we can support you here. We've got areas in which we have firefighters who are interested, which is a big part of it, have an interest, and so let's run the scheme. Let's see how it goes, and that's how it started. It started as a pilot scheme, if you will, and I was fortunate enough to be involved in that. And I'm hoping that through the success, and I will say it's been very, very successful, and it's been rolled out across multiple fire stations throughout Humberside as a county.
Still ongoing, successful as well.
Ongoing,
like
successful.
I was speaking to Kat before we came on, we're going to stick it in the notes of the podcast, but this is still ongoing.
Still ongoing,
We've
yeah,
seen
absolutely.
some great response, and I think it's going to be like a driver for change in how people get trained, but people can still contribute to this as well.
Definitely, and I think you're right, and I think there is an emphasis in the fire service. People are interested in trauma because it's the exciting stuff.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of those skills that we learn in managing a trauma patient are transferable across to a medical patient, and I think that's the key point here, is that a lot of these skills as firefighters are transferable. And I think the ambulance service has been good to acknowledge that and provide additional training where required to be able to get a really competent medic out doing a very, very good job and filling a gap.
I think they've done a lot more of it in terms of, for people's lack of familiarity, like heart teams and stuff like that. So they've seen the benefits of those crossovers. They're not trying to move in and take the fire services role or anything like that, and vice versa. Yeah. But when we think about JESIC, we think about blah, 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 blah. It's that whole collaborative aspect. We're all pretty good at what we do. Let's just share this knowledge, share this information, and it can. I think at the end of the end customer, without getting too businessy, the community are going to be able to benefit tremendously from these multi-skilled, educated individuals.
This is it, and I think for me, it's a case of just defining the roles very, very, very carefully and making sure that there isn't that resistance. Because the truth of the matter is there was some resistance, from the ambulance service staff, because 1 minute they're out treating patients, the next minute they've got firefighters turning up, taking their jobs off them, I think the way that
there's plenty enough for everybody out there. There really is.
I can agree, and that was very quickly dealt with, because actually through the definition of the role that we were doing and through explaining the role and the capacity that we were attending, it's very obvious that we're not there as paramedics. It's obvious that it's a very very different role, and the collaboration between the two has been fantastic, because paramedics have a better relationship, I think personally, with firefighters, because when they go to an RTC at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're now recognising some of these crew that they've dealt with at a previous incident in a medical capacity 12 hours previously. So it's building these sort of...
There's so much benefit from
relationships.
Just everywhere, and like training on stations together, and just all of the funds that are getting poured into different services, kind of working in silos sometimes. And that's where I love things like what you and Kat have done. You've kind of like building a bridge from one side to the other and going, hey, guys, we actually work together. So you cross this bridge and come through the authenticity of James, and vice versa. He can cross over and go, well, actually, I've worked with a paramedic, or I worked with a firefighter that's done a bit of this. Look at this. And they're like, that's amazing, because it's so hard for us to cross that bridge, especially from an academic side, because with the greatest respect, James, or in fact, I'll speak on my own behalf, Kat is certainly significantly more educated than I am. But in doing so, and Kat, I'd love your impressions on this, is I feel like people that I've worked with in the past who have done a lot of academic study can sometimes, and it doesn't seem in your case because you're obviously open enough to come on a podcast, which shows enough in itself. Some people lose those abilities to collaborate. Sometimes they get so used to self-study and working on their own and working on their subject matter so much that they unknowingly end up working in a silo. Would that be a fair comment? And it's not like a generalization of the industry, but
I can totally relate to that. I mean, that's linked to a lot of the stresses of just working in academia in general. You get very fixated on a particular area because you've become an expert in that area. And sometimes you forget about the kind of wider, like, different avenues you could go down. And actually, that's why teaching has actually been really amazing. I'm only relatively new to teaching. James is obviously one of my first students. And, you know, him bringing this project to me was like, oh, wow, that's super exciting. Like, definitely we can look into that. And that's actually really been a positive thing. And I think when people have been in academia for a long time and they might not have access to, might not teach as much as they would like, or, you know, get kind of bogged down in the more kind of admin side of things. Or they don't necessarily look into these opportunities as
I
much
think
as
it's
they
like
could.
alcohol in terms of like they go through a consistent distilling process where they go deeper and deeper and deeper into their subject matter, and it becomes so purified, if you know what I mean. They can't kind of step back out and step back up into the fresh air where knuckle dragging monkeys like me live, and then like talk to me, and I'm like, what's that? And they're like, dude, it's going to take me so long to explain it to you, it's really not worth it. With the greatest of respect for you, but this is kind of like, that's why I think this is such a unique opportunity, and I really wanted to have you guys on to capitalize on it, because it's quite rare to see what we're doing here. So I just wanted to pause for a second, actually, James, because you made a really good statement now, and I want to just dive into it a second. You said you were young enough to be able to retrain in something else. How young is young enough? Just as a random question, because we see people enter in different sectors at different ages now, and I think that's crazy and exciting in ways, because people used to think like, I'm fixed, I've learnt this thing, I can never do anything else, and that's different. You were brave enough to do it at your age.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and it's funny now that I should make that comment, because I was 26 when I made the decision that I'm probably at a crossroads, and now's the time to change career if I'm going to do it at all. Yeah. And now I think probably 46 is probably a good age, you know. So my perception has changed so much in 5 years, you know. And I look back now and think, actually, I don't know really why I put pressure upon myself to make that change and make that decision, because actually, and this is one of the messages I try and give to people now, having gone through this experience, to say, crikey, you know, you're around for long enough, you know, and there's so many opportunities. That's one of the things I try and really, really get out there and talk
I'm morbidly so excited now about like my next 25 years, which is I'm like in my 30s now, and people go, oh, what do you wish you'd have really got into? And the question itself, I have to like challenge. I don't want to become overly argumentative with people. I'm like, what do you mean, what do I wish I did? I'm doing it now.
Yeah.
I'm literally doing it now. You know, my youngest child is, Lily's 9. And I'm like, in like a couple of years, she's going to be rich. She's pretty independent already. And I'm like, I've still got like 30 years to make a difference. You know, I've had failures and successes, and businesses that have worked, businesses that haven't worked, failures in the fire service, embarrassments. And now I can speak about all of that from the other side. Sure. And I still feel so incredibly young in the grand scheme of it. When you see people like, you know, Harlan Sanders, you know, or people, Colonel Sanders, he did it when he was late 50s, or when he was 60, I think he sold his recipe, and people that have done these incredible things at later stages of their life. You know, I mean, how long did it take for you to study initially, Kat, just out of curiosity?
I've been in and out of study, to be quite honest, although I'm probably now a perpetual student. But originally I did my undergrad degree, my death investigation.
How long does that take?
3 years.
So 3 years to do an undergrad degree, and that's quite a high level of qualification for people such as me who have got GCSEs. With all due respect to anybody with GCSEs.
But to be fair, I actually attempted to go to university once before that, and then I dropped out, and then because I decided it wasn't for me. And then someone close to me said, oh, well, university is not for everyone. I was like, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. So I worked for a bit and then went back and did my undergrad. And then I worked again for about 6 years, various jobs within the industry and scientific jobs. And I was like, you know what, I'm a bit like stuck about what I want to do. I'm going to go back and do a master's. So then I did my master's in anthropology.
You've done all this, and you know, but you're still so young now. But you, like you say there, to 3 or 4 years to do a degree, whereas most people in their 30s or 40s will go, I should have trained to be a forensic scientist, or I should have trained to be I mean, even a firefighter, with the greatest respect, takes you 2 years to train for it. That's nothing in the grand scheme of it. If you were 50 now and then you say, oh, I wish I'd have been a firefighter. Dude, you do it now for 2 years, and then you could still spend like 10 years in that. 10 years is a career. If you've done something for a decade, people would be like, oh, you are a career X. You're a career forensics, you're a career fire, you're a career paramedic. You could have done something else for 30 years before that.
Sure. And we talk about 3 years for an undergraduate degree, but what is 3 years in a career? It's 3 years of a salary and you're doing the job that you did 3 years ago, you know. So it's kind of like, you know, I get this question a lot and people say to me, you know, you're X years old, you're 30 years old, but you're still a student. Yeah, but it's, you know, what's the difference between having a 30-year career working or a 30-year career with so many years studying, so many years working? It's all going towards a goal, you know.
Yes.
It's not going backwards, it's not standing still. It's whether you're doing a career and you're progressing within industry or whether you're accessing an industry through education. It's all forward movement, isn't it, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't think it really matters, actually.
I always think when people say stuff like that, like, oh, I really need to do some forward thinking in terms of my life. I'm like, all thinking is forward thinking. Thinking backwards is just remembering. So any thinking you're doing is all forward thinking, guys. So don't always. James, I wanted to just double down for a second. You mentioned the success of the project had stemmed from the support of your previous employer. So Humberside, a massive thanks to them. They jumped on board with the opportunity to support the research. Now, through that, you've visited numerous fire stations and you've had access to operational firefighters. And again, it's still open, so we can still do more of it. Now, the questionnaire you did. Now, I wanted to ask about this because it was designed with 4 clearly defined sections. So what sort of things were you actually asking people and how did the whole thing sort of separate out?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk to you a bit about the sections, but before I do that, it's probably worth just mentioning the actual production of the questionnaire.
Yes.
So this was
Because it wasn't thrown together.
It wasn't thrown together. This was probably, I think Kat will agree, this was probably the most complex part of the development of the project, actually, was getting the questionnaire right, because it had to be right, you know. And you know, in any...
I imagine as well, sorry, just Kat, if you change something like this halfway through, does it completely like ruin the data, or has it got to be perfect at the beginning, or is there a procrastination, like you don't have to make it perfect, or...
Perfect's a strong word.
Is a strong word, sorry.
But we want to make sure we've got it, you know, because we've got to ask the right questions.
Beyond all reasonable doubt, or something like that.
And just make sure we're trying to get the right amount of data and the right types of data, because that will influence any kind of interpretations or what we might choose to do with the data after that. But by nature, science, it progresses, it develops over time. So this project was for James's master's, so it's relatively small in the grand scheme of things, and we're hoping to scale it up once we have a bit more data to play
I love
with.
what you said there about how it always develops and how you can't just like ask one question at a time. It reminds me a lot about the podcast in itself, because sometimes I listen back to things and I think, oh God, I wish I'd have asked that person X. And then somebody goes, why don't you just go and ask them? I'm like, because it won't be different now, because I'm asking them in isolation. Like if you went back to these people and said, well, can you just answer question 11? Because we know we had 10 questions by now, and they'll have a different influence because it is a snapshot in time without the collective differences. So sorry, James, but I just wanted to double click on that.
No, quite right, yeah. So for me and for Kat, and when we started discussing how we were going to produce this questionnaire, it was really about making sure that this was a comprehensive questionnaire, and most importantly that it was anonymous, and that we had the confidence of firefighters to give us their data. Because we could have gone to the chief fire officer of any fire and rescue service and said, we want to know about your forensic capabilities, of your give us an SOP, let's have a look at that, let's have a read. But ultimately, an SOP or a standard operating procedure says one thing, but is that necessarily what's happening?
Reality?
Is that the reality? Is it? I'm not saying it's not.
If it's a tell rather than a sell, and what I mean by that is if somebody turns around and imposes it upon you, this questionnaire is mandatory, here's your email, and people are like, whatever.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? I don't care. So this is just for your benefit. You just want something so you can wave your flag and go, our service contributed in this. We wanted firefighters and emergency services as a whole to go, hey guys, how is this going to help you? I.e. the sell versus the tell. This is how we want to help you. But in order to do so, we just want a little bit of information. And it's anonymous. No one's going to come and club you over the head and go, but you said you never do this at incidents. You said in that investigate, you said in that questionnaire, I have never X. And people are like, oh, Jesus Christ, I won't put my name to it then. But
and that's exactly it. And we wanted people to sit down and listen to this, and we wanted them to be interested and want to feel that they could speak openly and honestly. And not only that, but we wanted to hear as much as possible, because inherently firefighters are doing a brilliant job out there, and we want to know what they're doing. It might be that they're doing
but
things,
also doesn't mean they can't do it better.
Precisely,
and that's
precisely.
People when they hear, can we give you some feedback? Here's some feedback on how you can do your job better, and you're like, what, CSAN and rubbish? No, not at all. But things have changed, and it's the unknown unknowns. Do you know what I mean? If you don't know, like we have a total obscure unawareness of forensics, then you don't know you could be doing it any better. So if now that you know better, you can do better.
Sure, exactly that. So we decided to move on from that. We decided that it was best if we were able to sort of break the questionnaire into 4 defined sections for a few reasons, but mainly so that we needed the questionnaire to be easy to navigate. We wanted it to be so that people could, understand what was being asked of them. And
also, if you have too many clicks to do with anything, people disengage. When you look at website, if you look at click-throughs, it's like, get there in 2 clicks. Otherwise, people are bored now.
This is it. So we spent a lot of time actually, and Kat will verify this, spent a lot of time going back and forward looking at actually question types. So how were we going to ask them? Were we going to use open and closed questions? Were we going to use free text answer boxes so people could type?
I love that you've done that.
No, so you're quite right. And we wanted people to be able to give as much information as they felt they wanted to. So sometimes with a click box answer, it's very hard to actually pick a defined answer. So we devised lots and lots of different questions. We included images on the questionnaire. So there's photos on there with which you can assess and you can give your opinions on. So that was a big part of producing the questionnaire. So the 4 sections.
How did you do that and not make it too wide as well? Because like it can't, when you're looking at data, you can't have 10,000 different answers of slight variations because you have to, we don't put people in boxes, but you've also, for the data to be qualitative and worth anything at all, you've got to be able to produce trends from it, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we spent a lot of time looking at terminology, like looking for specific areas that we want to assess, and that's why we focused it as well on mass fatality situations as well, because that's a smaller, rather than just general crime scenes or general accident scenes. Or
too many variations and something like that.
So we just wanted it to be like quite an isolated project, and like I said, so then later we can probably scale it up and look at other things. But yeah, even the structure of the questions, we looked at the order of the questions, and specifically the terminology. So we use words like, are you comfortable collecting potential evidences, identifying potential evidence at the scene. So
the words and what they mean to people. How was that discipline for you, James? Because I mean, for Kat, she not saying that we don't. Okay, I'll say I don't. For people on my level of whatever, might struggle to initially see the value in going that, but Kat's from an analytical mindset. She does all this all the time, so she'll see the value in making sure that's right. How did you balance that in terms of patience, where you're like, Kat, I've got to crack on with this, I've got to get it done, we're bleeding time, for God's sake, use whatever word you like. How was that for you, coming from your background?
A lot of that.
You just keep sending the questionnaires in, and yourself and your colleagues will be like, okay, now think about this, James. Can't we just send it out?
But you know what? It's interesting because that process was a big eye opener for me, because I was doing exactly as you said. I was going out there saying, well, I've handled this stuff.
Yeah. I've already spoken to a few people. Don't ask a few people yet. It's not ready.
It's not ready until we say it's ready. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, were you there?
Yeah, probably. I know me, and I know how I work when I've worked with people in businesses before. I'm like, does it really matter? And when you connect the dots looking backwards, and I'm sure now, we're kind of like the heart, maybe the 60-70% mark, because as I've already said, people can still access into this. But I'm sure retrospectively looking back now, you do see the tremendous value in that.
And even at the time, we laugh about the frustration. Of course, that's there, and we're excited, we want to get going. But it's about doing it right. And my eyes were opened actually to how little I knew about collecting data professionally and doing it properly. And so in one way, there was some frustration, but in the other way, it was very, very interesting to learn these skills. And I'm so fortunate that I had Kat and also Anna Williams alongside us offering this support. And without them, I simply wouldn't have been able to produce a questionnaire capable of getting so much quality data.
You'd have been me fumbling around in the dark, just doing best of intentions that never get you other. You were saying about divvying it into different sections, sorry.
Yeah, so we decided to start out. So section 1, so 4 sections. Section 1 looked at personnel specific information. So although we wanted to maintain anonymity, it's important that we're able to categorize and look at the data and where it's coming from. That's really important. So we're able to do that, find out all sorts of different information within that. So how long firefighters have been involved in the fire service, or how long they've been completing their role for, how much experience they had. It's also important to work out how much experience they have in this specific area. They may have been a firefighter with 25 years experience, never attended a mass fatality or mass casualty incident. Yeah. So, but in saying that, that's also interesting, because in that 25 years, just because they haven't attended such an incident doesn't mean they haven't picked up skills subconsciously in a lot of cases.
Subconsciously, but they've also seen debriefs, they'll have seen case studies, and all of this environmental bias that they've subconsciously onboarded is a very different thing. And like you say, you don't want to start putting people in boxes too much, but having been in something for a number of years, you get a conditioning, even if you're not aware of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we thought that was really important that we try and assess that, and we try and...
Because also they might still be having bleed over from something that was a situation 8 years ago, but SOPs, National Operational Guidance, blah, 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 has all changed since then. The vehicle's changed, the role has changed, the equipment you'd be given has changed. So maybe you've got a different impression because now we've got 2 trauma bags, whereas historically all you had was a defib and you didn't need to use it. And so how much involvement, again, gives you a different perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely right. And also their role may have changed in the fire service over that time. For 25 years they may have started as a firefighter, they may now be a watch manager, they may have taken on additional roles, and they may see it from a very different perspective.
Because in theory, a firefighter is always predominantly going to be the first person hands-on with the casualty care, not because they're getting told to, but like you say, an incident commander is going to, if you've been in the fire service for 2 years and then stepped up into an incident command or crew manager or watch manager position or whatever it may be, you are going to have a more holistic view of it, and maybe even have a slightly better, with the greatest respect to firefighters, or a different, should we say, interpretation of the qualitative value of this forensic data, because you know what happens afterwards. You've done how many fire investigations you've been involved in, X, right, that's going to skew the data as well, I suppose.
This is exactly right. And that moves us nicely onto section 2 of the questionnaire, which talks then about training and experience.
Okay.
So, of course, just because someone's done 25 years and they've never attended a mass fatality, mass casualty incident, doesn't mean they haven't done specific training in that area.
Absolutely.
And training, they may have more knowledge in that area based on training than someone who's attended one incident over a career of 3 years. So we wanted to find out what training, and the other thing that was really interesting actually with the production of this section of the questionnaire was establishing what training they had in other careers that they had done. So as we...
You know what? That's a great point.
Because as we know, the fire service is dynamic. We have people who have come into the fire service with military careers, military backgrounds, seen dealt with a lot of experience in this niche area, or maybe just... had a lot of training in this area. We have people coming from a police background. All walks of life. So we can't disregard that information. We need to gather that.
You're absolutely right. The reason I'm smirking now, I think I'm such a bloody freak sometimes in the fire service, and I said that with respect in the term, is before I did this, I was a continuous improvement manager. So we did like Six Sigma, Kaizen, large scale problem solving on like fast moving consumer goods line, and that makes you inherently curious and sometimes challenging, because we do things like 5 why processes almost every day, and I suppose it's for yourself as well, Kat. It's never about being right or wrong. You're not married to the answer. You're not married to the idea. The whole idea of forensics and science in itself is about celebrating the disproving or proving of something else. So it's a constant iterative process of challenge. Whereas for some people, if they've been in somewhere where they've just been dictated to all the time, they may have been conditioned that challenging something is very inappropriate. It's very rude. It's very disrespectful, and that you shouldn't challenge. And they'll come in and not challenge. Whereas you get people now, like myself, going, why are we doing that again? Because it was based on something a decade ago. Oh, wicked. So have we rethought about this? And that can be very exhausting for people. But you're so right. People's conditioning from what they've done before. Also, you see people coming from like the care sector. Sure. And, one of my people on my watch was a counsellor in the prison service. And I'm like, wow, their level of emotional intelligence is colossal in compared to some of the people that we work with. So, and I think you're finding that more and more. Like we said about changing careers. People that change careers 10, 15 years into their working life bring such wealth to the fire service and other roles as well.
And I think this is what people forget. And you change your career, you start a new career. You don't wipe the slate clean. You don't forget everything you've ever learned. You take those skills with you.
Nor should you want to.
And nor should you want to. And this is it. And so we need to really embrace.
Imagine when somebody like Kat comes in at station officer level or something like that. She is gonna absolutely shatter what we're doing. She'll be like, "This doesn't make any logical sense, guys. Who came up with this? Okay. How long ago did they retire?" Anyway, we digress. But when some people that live in the real world outside the emergency services, sometimes they're like, what are you doing? Okay.
It's a valuable question as well. It's a valuable question.
Course.
So once we gathered that sort of that information, it was a case then of moving on to section 3, which was interpretation. So we were looking at, now that we know who we're taking information from, and we know what training or experience they've had, let's try and quantify, or let's try and evaluate, their interpretation of attending these incidents from a forensic perspective, and sort of gauge their level of awareness and understanding. So this is where these sort of questions came in that we talked about previously, and we gave lots of different questions, and we tried to gain as much data and different types of data, and like I say, we used some images which people could assess and look at and give their opinion on.
Because it's a great observation of different learning styles there as well, because some people may or may not have gone, well, we've all gone through a different level of education to some extent, and you can alienate people and it can appear like they're disinterested simply because they can't bloody understand what you're saying. You might structure something from your own biases and go, well, this is how I like to read them. Okay, but Kat, you're very well educated. You know, the rest of us need a few pictures here and there. To be honest with you, it helps us kinesthetic learners see what's going on a little bit.
I like a picture, don't worry.
Love a good picture.
Yeah, and also I think as well, you know, by using an image, it sort of brings to light and it jogs people's memories because, you know, doing the role of, as a role of a firefighter, you know, it's a practical job. Yeah. You're out at scenes, you're taking in not just academic information from a piece of paper, but you're taking in actual information. You're using your eyes, you're using your ears, you're using, you know, and we can't turn our eye on that. You know, that's really important. We tap into that. And I think by using images that firefighters can look at, you know, and assess, it gives people a wider perspective and it reminds them of incidents they've been at, or it triggers a different thinking points. It triggers a different way of thinking.
Drags things out the subconscious.
Absolutely
where
right.
They almost have like a subconscious deja vu. You know,
Absolutely
where they're like,
right.
oh yeah, I get it now. You know, and I see what you're saying with that.
That's what, you know, a really important aspect is basically getting that balance between engagement and interest and wanting people to want to learn the questionnaire versus information gathering. So we obviously want this data, but we also want people to be willingly giving that data. And
want your impression on the data.
Yeah, and we want it to be completely without bias. So we just want their genuine opinion and experience. And that's the most valuable part of the data.
I love that. That must be so hard to get it that pure. Because whenever I regularly think this when I look back on some of my conversations with people, I'm like, how much of it was their thoughts? Because I get so bloody excited about stuff sometimes that I think my own conscious bias ends up bleeding over into the conversation too much. I need to shut up sometimes.
And just to follow on from what Kat said there, you know, in the title of the project, we used the word awareness. You know, we wanted to assess awareness, and that is a word that we chose very, very
forgiving
carefully.
Word, isn't it?
It's a forgiving word, and we chose it because at the end of the
you're
day,
not being trained, you're not being examined, you're not being assessed.
Correct, and that's a really important point. And I made that very clear when I you know, disseminated this project. You know, I spoke to people because this isn't about saying, you know, there is no prerequisite for you to be a forensic scientist to be a firefighter. So, you know, with all due respect to me and Kat and people doing this, you know, firefighters are well within their right to say, well, what's it any of your business? I'm a firefighter, you know. And so this is where we came up with this word awareness.
Usually said out of fear, with all due respect. And that's okay, because sometimes we don't want to get found out. We're like, oh my God, I've been in this job for 15 years and I don't know anything about this. Is someone going to tell me I'm crap?
And this is the thing, you know, and I think with Humberside, I can only speak on behalf of Humberside, but, you know, they were, credit to them, they were really keen to say, you know, well, actually, let's have a look at, you know, and if
that's the reality, you want to know what the reality is. There's no point in going, assuming that people know, because you're actually setting them up to fail. And it's actually quite horrible, really, in terms of, you know, if you truly assessed your staff's capability and knew that they had a massive deficiency here, if you didn't know, that's okay, you know. But then when you find it out, you don't have to get scared that we're sending people out there with absolutely no awareness. But that's actually been the case for the last 50 years. So now we know, wonderful. Let's applaud that. Okay. Now we can bring in some awareness, some training, whatever it may be.
Exactly. And by using that term awareness, you know, it's like you say, it takes away that element of it's right, it's wrong, it's indifferent. You know, it's an awareness.
Another great example of this, I think, is like you see a lot of the equality, diversity, and inclusion. That is like a fantastic example of this, because we're all operating out of our own like subconscious biases, again, from our own nature, nurture. Or I was raised up and my dad always used to use this word, or he used to use that word, and that family of that origin used to live around the corner. And we just don't know you might have had a great relationship with them, but using day-to-day terminology in your whatever cul-de-sac that is now entirely inappropriate, but you didn't know it, so hence the awareness piece.
This is really important. Yeah, and it like you say, it bleeds across into all different areas, doesn't it? And it just makes people, I think, feel more comfortable, and they should feel comfortable, you know, completing this questionnaire. It's
100%.
It's not a witch hunt. This is so that we can be better and we can find out, we can establish information.
It's quite quick as well. I find it quite quick to do. I don't like taking ages.
And that's the thing as well. You know, we gave that a lot of thought. We don't want people getting halfway through and thinking, oh, I'm bored now. It's much of the same. I've got other things. You know, there's a good Netflix.
But kind of like when you've got somebody doing it in itself, you must be like, what was the level you thought is too long? How long is too long to take an assessment, do you think?
Don't really know, really.
It depends on the person's level of interest in it as well, doesn't it? But when it's a completely unknown, you know, you and I we know who's roughly listening to the podcast-ish, the type of person, but it could be anybody. So how do we assess that for the general population? What is too long?
Well, I think a kind of good indicator for that was James did visit, obviously, and do presentations in person. So I think I hope they would have said at the time, like, this is too long, or, you know, we didn't, you know, found this difficult, or we didn't understand that. And like I said before, you know, it's development. We can just take that knowledge and we can run with it, and in anything future research-wise, we could change it or adapt it. This was because it was for a master's. It was only a small little project. So this is just the start of bigger things, hopefully.
It's just a master's, James. It's nothing,
Just a
nothing
master's.
impressive,
You
mate.
heard it here
It's
first.
not like a GCSE, mate. It's nothing life-changing. All right, brother. Get back in your box.
That told me,
It's
didn't
not
it?
a doctorate, mate. All right. Wind your neck in.
But yeah, you're right. And I think Kat touched on a really important point there, actually, that Humberside were really, really good in letting me be part of this project and give me the access. But one thing I was able to do is actually go out and visit fire stations and actually go back and speak to my colleagues, my previous colleagues. And
That's where the USP of something like this,
of course,
really
it's
lies.
so valuable. And and I made it very much an open forum. It was there was a presentation which I delivered, and there were slides and we could talk through it. But it was just an opportunity for me to stand there and just get some interest going and get the interest flowing and
Start the conversation.
And it's amazing how once you start that conversation, it just goes, doesn't it? And
Well, we made each other at the emergency services show, and it was just from that. You thrust a piece of paper in my face, and I was like, "What is this?" And I looked at it and went, "That's bloody interesting." And I'll be honest, I initially thought you were with the greatest. I thought you were somebody like Kat. I was like, "Yeah, but do you really know? Like, is this even going to go anywhere? Because what level of conception do you have of this industry?" And then you were like, paramedic, firefighter, stuff like that. And I was extremely interested. And I appreciate maybe I'm an easy sell because I'm really interested in lots and lots of stuff. But if you hadn't have had that level of authenticity, which is a little bit harsh because sometimes you can lose the validity of something just because of the person that's necessarily delivering it, which is really sad. And that's probably something we all need to work on. But I say, once you start that conversation, I think a lot of people will be like, "Oh, can I ask you about this? Can I?" I always think like when we have like hazmat training and stuff like that, some of it's really clinical and boring. But if you get somebody just open up the conversation, some people have some fascinating questions. And definitely. I think if Kat sat in front of a room of firefighters, I think they could go for 4 or 5 hours and people would still have questions.
Easily.
Because what about this? What about if that happens?
Yeah.
What about this? What if I did this? Would that make it better? Should we put it in a bag before or after? What if a cat, come and have a look on the fire engine, our salvage sheet, right? And she'd be like, "Jesus Christ, guys, just... we can't throw it all away because it's all contaminated." Okay, just let's start there.
But this is it, and I think it's really important as well. And I'm in a very unique and fortunate position. I class myself as being very
And fair play
fortunate.
to Humberside as well.
Massive fair play to Humberside, and that's a really
Because some of them
important
might
point
go
to
like, "Oh, I don't want you to look in the cupboard."
Yeah.
Because what if you found something really bad?
Precisely, don't come here. And this is it. And I think what helped is being able to stand in front of a group of people and say, I've sat with you guys. Do you know what I mean? I'm not coming here saying I'm a forensic scientist and I'll tell you X, Y, and Z, and you'll listen. And I was able to say, "Look, guys, I understand the issues that are out there. I've seen it myself." One of the reasons that drove me to complete this project is because I'm personally aware of the problems that I've dealt with and I've come across, and that's authentic, isn't it? That people can't deny that. That's and I think that helps. It builds confidence, and it makes people want to open up and be honest. And
most people in the emergency services are really up for open and willing to develop the stuff, because sometimes if the communities knew, I'm not saying this in a bad way, but if the communities knew how in the Stone Ages we are with certain things, we're doing the best we possibly can. We're super resourceful. We get a limited amount of funding and we're trying to learn as much as we can. But it feels like constantly we're behind the curve. When I have conversations like this with yourself and certainly with Kat, I feel like part of me is really excited because I'm like, we're learning something new. But then part of me is also quite sad because it really throws open the curtains on how little I was aware of the value of some of this. But until you're able to sort of swallow that pill, you're never going to learn, I suppose.
No, that's totally right, totally true.
The beauty of the collaboration, because it's a knowledge share at the end of the day. So, we're learning from James as much as James is learning from us, and therefore we can make this really interesting bit of research and show, what our intentions are as well, because James is the front of it. This is why we're doing it. So again, we're not trying to pick fault or anything. It's all about, like I said, knowledge share. And
what were the other areas?
So and the final section, the fourth section was looking at management specifically. So crew manager or above, so a substantial management position within the fire service at an operational level, and that was an interesting one. So we wanted to see. So we knew that we were assessing the awareness of operational firefighters per se, but actually, was there any differentiation between the knowledge or the awareness between managers and firefighters? So, there's an expectation that managers will have superior knowledge and they know everything there is to know, and often that is the case, and that's good. So we wanted to know if that was the case with forensic awareness, and what could they offer us? Is it, we didn't want to exclude the opinions of managers who maybe had additional training.
I think they get a lot of extra training in certain things, and I operate in a certain position within the fire service, but also there's a limited time in the day, so you also miss out on a lot of other valuable input because they can be so busy doing other aspects of their role. You really are starting to manage a company/business. It's less about the day-to-day role, and you can become detached from the people and some of these really valuable inputs because you're off having a meeting about whatever and you don't get that level of input. And also there's the other side of the coin when you get certain managers/officers/leaders in organizations in general who will go, I'm happy for you to assess our staff. And we go, oh, no, you as well. And they go, no, this is not for my benefit. This is for their benefit. And we're like, no, it's for everybody's benefit. And some people can be reluctant of that. But like you say, a lot of them, and I'm going to generalize now, a lot of them will be very open and willing to this. Was that your experience?
And that was exactly my experience. And to be honest with you, I sort of expected that, given that the fire service was so forthcoming. So my initial approach to this was with the chief fire officer at Humberside Fire Rescue Service, and he initially was on board with this. So that says a lot, doesn't it? That if it's been sort of given the thumbs up from the top, you would like to think that would be supported by his colleagues and by other
That's
managers.
been the success of a lot of what we've done as well. Since we've had chiefs of different things step forward into the void and show that the ice isn't going to break, a lot of other people have tentatively been able to walk out and go, okay, well, let's share a little bit more about what we're doing, because they're like, I'm not going to get sacked because you've already done it.
And this is exactly it. And I think that's what we found with this. We found that actually we got a really good response from the managers. So I sort of half expected it and sort of tentatively expected it, and I was very pleased with the results we got. So very, very relieved with that.
So, Kat, listening to sort of some of the detail that James has been going through there, what were you sort of most interested in seeing? Obviously, you've been really involved in the structuring of the questionnaire as well, but where did you think we were going to see some of the biggest things? And obviously, James is going to come on to the outcomes, but what were you most interested in seeing from it?
To be completely honest, we didn't actually have many preconceptions because it's so
best way to be, I suppose.
Hugely based on James's kind of personal experience. We were quite open-minded about what kind of information we were going to look at. We had a couple of hypotheses about possibly not much training in forensics, which is understandable, obviously. That's why some of the questions seemed quite simple, because we just wanted to get that kind of foundation of knowledge, so then we can go from there. But
it really is going to be part of I can see this being much more a long set, set of work, because the more we can lift this whole knowledge base up, but also you've got to turn it up so slowly. It's like turning up the temperature in a pot, isn't it? You could burn people really quickly with something like this by throwing them into a level 5 forensics course, and they'd be like, how is this relatable to my job? And just switch them off straight away.
Exactly. I mean, we're trying not to aim it at being, you need to know this, or, it's bad that you don't have this, or we were kind of aiming at, well, what are you interested in? So there was one particular question, was a selection of different forensic disciplines. Out of any of these, would you be interested in training in these, or do you think these would be useful? That kind of approach to it. Because we have this amazing partnership with the LFSA, the Lancashire Forensic Science Academy, who train police officers and things like that. We've got that kind of understanding about potential training or maybe future courses if we want to go down that route. But
I think some people look at the police and stuff and go, oh, jack of all trades, master of none. And I'm like, yeah, but do you know where the whole of that phrase actually started? So it's only half of a phrase, that is. It goes, the jack of all trades, master of none is better by far than a master of one, is actually the complete thing.
Which changes it a lot.
Changes the whole thing. But people only hear the first bit. And I often think of my interests and stuff like that. I'm like, when you've got so many different experiences, and this echoes through so many different things we've spoken about today, is it layers everything, and you start looking at life or incidents or relationships or whatever as like a cube. There's so many different angles to it, but if you only know one thing, you see one perspective. You see one side of the cube, whereas that's where I look at, and I compliment to police officers here, where they can look at things from so many different angles. And I think about that now as we're trying to upgrade and upskill emergency services frontline workers as much as we can. We need to just put our finger in the cup of so many different things, because we need to at least have a conceptual understanding, even if then that's simply to signpost them or capture information that we can then send off to the next level of forensic data, for example, or even like vulnerable people. We just capture that surface level data so we know what we're looking for, and we know what are the indicators that will trigger us to move on to the next stage.
Exactly, and it's just starting that conversation like we said before, and just seeing where we can go with it, and it's more of a question about if we can help, or if you would like to have this training or this knowledge, then we can maybe have a chat.
The worst thing that could happen, like you say, is for somebody to turn around and go, chief, with the best of intention, to go, you know what? We've seen it. Everybody must be, by the end of December, must be a level 2 for it. And we go, oh God, no, don't do that. You're going to switch everybody off, and you're going to ruin all, because then next time you go, hey folks, give us your input on the step. They're like, oh, what? So you can send me another mandatory course? And we're like, no, because what's going on? So James, what were some of the things that we saw, sort of the takeaways from it? Some of the biggest surprises you thought we saw come from it so far?
So far, yeah. So I think the first thing that we saw that sort of interested me to begin with, the first instance was how the data really represented the demographics of the fire service. So in terms of the age of the participants and in terms of the experience, it really fitted in nicely with the demographics in the UK. So that shows us that we've got a good quality of data, which is really, that's the first tick in the box.
It stops the pessimists going, ouch, you clearly only had men aged between 30 and 35 answer this questionnaire, because the data would sit and you're like, well, no, that's not the case. I'm looking at it now.
That's exactly it. You're quite right. And so for me, that was the big sort of like golden moment that, we've got some quality data here.
That must have at least been like a sigh of relief and going, okay, we're going in the right direction.
Yeah. So whatever the data tells us now, at least we know it's valid to a certain extent. To a certain extent. So that was good. That was a good start. So, there was a few things. So one of the things that interested me actually is that 74% of the firefighters stated that they currently preserve evidence as part of their role, which is interesting. So that's good to know that despite the level of training that they've got, they're still actively trying in whatever capacity.
And for some people, with all due respect, their idea of doing that might literally be because they watched a CSI thing once and they were like, you know what? This might be a malicious fire. Mm-hmm. Maybe if we... Oh, no, guys, don't stand over there. Mm-hmm. Actually, no, we don't keep walking through the front door because we've been in there. Everyone just wants to go in for a Lucky Lou. You don't need to be in there anymore. Let's preserve that immediate...
Well, it's funny you should say that because I've got a statistic to back that up.
Love it.
You planned that, didn't you? Yeah, perfectly. So we also found out that 84.6%, so 85% of firefighters reported low levels of confidence in handling and preserving evidence. And the same statistic, so 85%, also stated that they received either one-off training or never received training in either identifying or preserving forensic evidence. So that's interesting. So we've got...
How much of that... So just to classify it for us, Kat, between forensic evidence... Is forensic evidence and like fire investigation evidence, so would we classify them as the same thing? Does fire investigation evidence sit within the realm of forensic, or could it?
It could do. I think basically...
Because maybe that's where some of it's coming on. Because I immediately look at that and go... I don't know what I did answer when I answered it, actually. Maybe I answered yes or no, I can't remember. But I feel like, I don't feel like I've ever had, I suppose it's if you understand what forensic means, and I'm kind of on the borderline with it. I don't know if I've ever had training labelled as that, but subconsciously, certainly from the fire service perspective, I've definitely received training about, like I say, maintaining evidence or preserving evidence.
Yeah, well, I think there was actually a specific question about the definition of forensic evidence.
I'm treading all over James's, sorry. I'm sorry.
It's quite all right.
In general, forensic evidence, we kept using the phrase potential forensic evidence as well, because forensic evidence is really anything, it could be literally anything that's related to the crime. So it doesn't have to be, the kind of stereotypical, like a blooded knife or something like that. It could be literally, it could be a cigarette butt. It could be, a can of pop.
It wasn't a candlestick in the larder, Professor Green or whoever it was.
So forensic evidence is just items that we deam to be forensically significant.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So we said that people had to one-off all that they feel like they'd never received training.
So we saw sort of, really what that shows us is actually statistically low levels of training, in forensic awareness or forensic evidence.
But even in spite of that, they were still trying to.
And this is the point. So that's really interesting.
That shows an appetite for it.
Well, that's what it shows us. So it shows us, one, it shows an appetite. Two, it shows us, though, we need to go a bit further with this. And then you touched on a really good point earlier. You mentioned, people then getting information or ideas from what they've seen on TV or what they've seen in dramas.
What does Google say?
Yeah, precisely. There you go. Well, there you go. And this is it. But we can't
just type in forensics for it.
This is it. And we can't get away from the fact that actually this is really good, that people are wanting to do the right thing.
Yeah. And so give them a mechanism to develop themselves. Otherwise, they'll just do it.
Yeah. And I think to round those statistics off, the number one finding for me, the absolute golden bullet for me, was the fact that 100%, so every person who completed this questionnaire said that at least one element of training in forensic awareness, of any type of training, would increase their awareness. So, from that statistic, everybody had an interest in nobody said no. They didn't think there would be any value in having forensic awareness training. So that says a lot for itself. That says a lot for us going forward with this. It gives us the green light and it says, okay,
it was actually slightly higher with some of the managers as well, wasn't it? And that's not to say that they're less educated, but they felt less confident, again, because maybe they're not interacting with it as much. When you move into that sort of role, you are not the incident commander anymore. You are not. A lot of the preservation of the evidence may have already happened or the benefit of it happening would have been before you even got there.
Yeah, you're quite right. So the statistic you're referring to is 76% of managers state that they have no confidence in effectively managing an incident from a forensic perspective.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Over
That's more than
3/4.
three-quarters. A lot of people. So, you know, and if we take it a step further...
I can do that maths.
You can do that, yeah.
GCSE level stuff, that I'm good.
And if we take it a step further, you know, almost 96% of managers stated that they'd either received one-off training or never, or never had training.
And I think that reflects the fact we talk about generationally. They potentially, and I don't want to put biases in place here, but theoretically they've perhaps been in the careers longer. We never did anything like this further on before. And even now, you know, things such as the work you're doing with Kat, it's only coming out now.
Sure.
So recruits
Absolutely.
as of 2021 onwards
Yeah.
will have a greater input,
Sure.
even if, with the greatest respect to the podcast, even if it's just somebody having a collective conversation
Yeah,
like this.
absolutely
but
right.
That's where we've got to give this stuff a platform.
You know, and I think this is a really good point, actually, to just interject and say, you know, we've got these statistics, we've spoken about what these statistics mean and how stark the numbers are, but actually we need to just remind ourselves that you know, the fire and rescue service, that, you know, they're under no legislation that states they must have this, you know.
No,
almost.
yeah, and that's it. And that's the kind of consistently dynamic, expanding role of the. So when we look at that, you know, kid in a toy shop, it's like there's so many needs that somebody needs to pick up, and now we're at the point where we're looking around and we're like, police, are you going to do it? I ain't got any staff. Ambulance, are you going to do it? I ain't got any staff. You know, when the fire service is like, we've got some staff, we need some training, we need some help. You know, we've got really good at putting out fires, to be honest, and the prevention aspect of it is fantastic. You know, let's pat ourselves on the back for a minute, but now it's like we have the ability to take on some different challenges. Where do we want to apply? I would much rather be applying my resources and stuff to development such as this versus some stuff that's less appealing to me, to be honest.
Sure, and if we go full circle and we go right the way back to the beginning of this conversation, you know, we talked about the fire service interest in collaborating with the ambulance service. You know, we 100%. Proved it, but it's happening. You know, these resources are being used in other areas, and it's working, and it's having a positive impact on the community. So why not? I
feel like when you
out?
removed the political barriers during the pandemic, and it was kind of like, hey, everybody, just all hands on deck, who can help out? The willingness was there. So the willingness for collaboration is there. It's just about trying to navigate that crazy political, and none of us are going to pretend to know anything about that. But it's like, if we can get through that, we want to learn, we want to develop, we want to become well-rounded individuals who have got better skill sets such as this.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
Kat. Now, we said, you know, as James was going through some of the statistics there, that 100%, that's a lot, even for my mind to comprehend, of the participants, I think that's nearly everybody, stated that at least one area of forensic training would increase their ability to preserve either the scene of forensic evidence at the scene. It shows that there's a desire there. I suppose the challenge off the back of that is, where do we go in terms of, you know, when the call to action has been made to the sector, and in this conversation you are representative of that sector. I appreciate you're one part of a much larger body, and you can't go around training everybody. Where could we start with something like that? Because you could look across, you know, you and Anna and people like that would look across all the studies you've done and gone, where should we start? Because each module is 3 months long, and they haven't got the equipment, they haven't got this and this. How do you dilute it to the point where it's actionable and beneficial to people, and still help people follow your empower, and then with some knowledge, I suppose?
So it's just starting at the beginning, really. There's always a starting point. So because we're in such a fortunate position to be in this collaboration with the LFSA, who have that kind of understanding about how training can be conducted and things like that, we've got that really good support. But we're
time though as well, isn't it?
This time,
Jesus,
and people,
time.
obviously.
People, resources, Jesus.
But what we're kind of focusing on at the moment is further developing this questionnaire, so we can fine-tune some of the results that we found, kind of, you know, dig a bit deeper, find out exactly what they'd like to learn. Is it something they're interested in following up with us? Like, could we provide that? Because obviously forensics is such a huge industry in itself. There's so many different disciplines. Myself and Anna, we concentrate on anthropology and taphonomy.
What's that?
Anthropology is the study of skeletons, basically, and bones. And in a forensic context is looking at skeletal remains to look for different landmarks and shapes and sizes and things like that. And we come up with something called an osteological profile. So that's just overall profile of the different possible age, possible sex, the stature of the individual. And that helps with criminal investigations from an identity point of view. So helping to identify people, because obviously once decomposition reaches the skeleton stage. I was going to say,
because you see a lot of stuff, I think, in forensic science now, from my very limited interpretation, where things that we're realizing and coming up with now are empowering you to go back like decades to prove or disprove or support the collected evidence from so long ago. There's so many benefits where your work can really help us gain a greater understanding from things that it's not just something that's going to help us moving forwards. This can actually stretch backwards as well, can't it, in so many cases?
Well, that's the thing, because obviously this is anthropology is also very much paired with archaeology, and
I thought that's what it was when I first read it.
that's
I'm not going to say it because I could have come out and gone, so tell me about archaeology. It's like, that's probably more a question for somebody that does archaeology. Do you want to speak? Oh, yeah, okay.
But that's the thing, all these disciplines are intertwined though. So I'm very much trained in human osteology, so I look at human bones, but there are people that are specialists in animal bones, and also obviously in civilizations from much further back in time. Whereas I'm, from a forensic point of view, that's generally concerned with anything that's up to about 100 years old, a case.
Even that in itself, though, is quite colossal.
Yeah. So it's
body
just
of work to be involved in.
So
whilst you're coddling people like me and James in your part-time, helping us develop our rudimentary skills.
But just from a kind of training point of view, it's just the basics of people might not actually be familiar with bones, or particularly if they're fragmented as well, so there might just be a little bit of bone. And that's where my PhD comes in as well, that I'm currently studying, is looking at being able to differentiate between bone.
That's better than a master's, by the way.
Yes, so I'm finding out.
I think it's not quite a GCSE. It's somewhere in between.
Somewhere in
the two.
between,
I'll
I
explain
think.
it to you
Yeah,
afterwards,
yeah.
it's fine.
And looking at differentiating between bone and other things, or other bones, so animal versus human and things like that. Again, just to kind of come up with practical skills that we could help criminal investigations and crime scene analysis and things like that.
I always think of it a little bit like casinos, and what I mean by that is, because you're in like probably an unknown battle. I don't know if you know you're in a battle at all. Maybe I'm going to educate you. I don't doubt it, but it's kind of like people that are ill means and ill morals and poor motivations are finding some incredibly resourceful ways to do bad things, get rid of people or dispose of people or whatever it may be, and where they choose to put them and stuff like that. So as technology accelerates, it's kind of like a casino that comes up with a rule and they try and bypass the rule or find a different way for it to look a certain way, and then you've got to keep delving down and realizing, wow, they're doing this now and they're doing that now, and that floors one of the processes that we used to use for identification now is so much more difficult. So I suppose there's never really going to be an end to this kind of work.
There's never an end to research. That's the thing, and even things like the CSI programs and things that you see in all the forensic TV shows and films actually is kind of bad for forensics, because it's making people more aware, even on a kind of, I mean, they're not always right, we know this, but on a kind of rudimentary kind of level, it
encourages people to at least think in that creative capacity, doesn't it? That's got to be really frustrating and difficult for people such as yourself, because I get how it's sexy and interesting, but the difference between when people just used to read a forensic novel, do you know what I mean, or they read a crime novel, very different now to the level of depth that these people are going, because they want to be authentic and when they're filming this stuff, but they're getting so authentic that they're kind of pulling the veil back on what's actually happening behind it. And I see that with the government sometimes, where they're like, we're going to freely make a lot of our stuff freely available on the internet so that people know we're transparent. And I'm also like, yeah, that's fine for somebody like me who works for you in the emergency services. What about everybody else that wants to find out a way to get around it? And you're like, I suppose it's a tough place to sit for them.
Well, that's the thing, and that's why we are constantly evolving, and why collaborations are so important, because as I said, I'm just one specialism in a huge industry. So from a training point of view, we have all these different people that we could collaborate with or provide training with, or there's some really good examples of things that you wouldn't necessarily think of forensics, like there's forensic jewelry is a thing now, and stuff like that. So not just the traditional DNA and fingerprints and stuff. It's huge, gait analysis. So.
Didn't you also do some gait analysis, as in the way people walk?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I remember, get it now, but there was a crime committed, and like you said, they trawled through. I think it's somewhere it's China, isn't it? Where it's one of the most CCTV places in all of the world, and they can identify people from their gait. Mm-hmm. That is just petrifying, perhaps for some people, but also for me, I'm like, that's great. Yeah. To a certain extent. So if you're trying to hide something, I'd want to know about it as soon as possible anyway, just to keep everybody a little bit safer. But yeah, that aspect of it, it's not just size of your shoes and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. It really gets quite granular now.
But it's also very tricky because, with all this development, then certain disciplines might fall, I wouldn't say slightly out of a favour, but they're more critically analysed. So there's a big push towards making forensics more quantifiable, statistically analysed, so that it's more robust when it gets to a courtroom situation.
I was about to say, so that it is actually actionable and it's robust, so so that because the people that are on the other side of the coin defending somebody, you know, while looking for anything in your study, anything in your data, anything in your profession where it says in theory or based on this we should assume, and we're like, so you're assuming then, are you? So you don't really know actually. You want to put my client to death because you don't really know, not to death, but you know what I mean? So it's constant that battle. You almost need to pause, solidify what the knowledge that you've got to make it actionable, but in doing so it stops you going on and delving in further into the research.
So yeah, just constantly ongoing about trying to improve and develop new things, but then make sure that old things are still good enough to use, and yeah, that's forensics.
Aren't you also doing something I read during our sort of conversation before this about identifying remains within water? Something to do with that. So that seemed crazy and fascinating, because I always look at light scatter and stuff like that and the differences when it changes through water. I always find that really fascinating, and how we use it with thermal imaging. And it seems such a generic thing you think we should know so much about, but how it changes as it moves through different spheres and planes of life and all that sort of stuff. How are you looking at that in terms of remains in water and stuff like that?
So my project, this is my PhD again, is specifically looking at using...
PhD again there, James.
There you go, just putting that out there.
Just putting that out there. I've got a 5 metre swimming badge as well. I didn't want to bring that up, but I will just write that down. I'll put it in the notes of the podcast. Well, if we're bringing out the guns, just saying, do want to have to bring it up.
So I'm looking at different light sources. You know, the traditional light sources that you see in CSI, the different coloured lights to look at different types of evidence. I'm kind of using that technology, but in a different, more novel way. There is a little bit of research out there at the moment, but not a lot, because a lot of the kind of search strategies looking for people who are submerged in water are looking for whole people, very fresh missing people, whereas because my specialism is forensic anthropology and then taphonomy, and that's the study of decomposition, I'm looking more for the skeletal remains, because there's not...
So how does the matter change as it ages in different types of water, and then how can that be identifiable? Because I suppose when we talk about light, a really basic way for people like me to probably understand that is when you look at a room and then you look at a room under blue light. Or
exactly.
That's a very rudimentary understanding of it, but when you apply that then to... And also as the organic matter changes, as it goes through levels of decomposition, how you detect it will of course change as well. As different things, people look at a decomposing body, it starts to look different, smell different, give off different gases, but it's still the same thing in a different point in its stage.
So many different analytical techniques for each kind of stage of the decomposition. Obviously my light sources are looking at the very end of decomp, where there's just the bones left really, and trying to make those bones more visible and more obvious to people that are searching for missing people. And the crime light's hopefully going to do that. That's my hypothesis.
So James, taking us back into your rudimentary study that we were here to talk about today.
I'm learning lots. It's super. It's good.
We should be charging people for this. So we've spoken about some of the ways that Kat sort of comes down from up on high and helps us understand some of the stuff that we can take away from it. For us, and for certainly for yourself, you're kind of like sitting on both. You've got one leg in both camps. What do you see as some of the most actionable takeaways for people at the moment? Because again, this study is ongoing, and like Kat said, it's hopefully going to act as one level of something we can then build upon. We're kind of putting the foundations in here. But what from just this study so far in itself do you think would give people a good, obviously they can come and listen to stuff like this, but what are some of the takeaways you think people can have from it?
Well, I think we've just talked now, haven't we, in quite in depth about forensics in general, and it just goes to show how broad of a subject it is, and that's the issue here, isn't it? It's because how can where do you start? That's it. So I think what we've really managed to get it down to is an awareness. You know, we come back to this awareness again. So it's not really practically possible to, let's say, you know, let's train all operational firefighters in, you know, scene preservation, collection of evidence. You go on and on, don't you? But what I think,
do you have a desire to do things similar to this? Question for either of you, for like paramedics and police officers as well. But are we involving too many biases there? I know this is maybe like conversations you were having right at the beginning of it. Was there an initial appetite to go, let's ask all of them?
Yeah, so there definitely was, because it's exciting and we want to go as far and as broad as we can with this. So this is open to ambulance service, frontline ambulance service staff and firefighters. Wicked. So it's open to everybody. So the reason... Because
we have had a few paramedics on, and I know there's quite a few that listen as well.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of interest. I know, you know, given the nature of this podcast, we've talked a lot about the fire service, but actually
they may even see I always feel like they'll see even greater benefit
potentially
from a paramedic and a police officer. They might see
potentially,
because they maybe get interacted more with fatalities.
It's hard to say. It's hard to say on that front. But what's interesting is we had a good response from the ambulance service, and I was very clear from the outset not to label a profession. I didn't want to say paramedics because there are so many wonderful frontline ambulance service staff in the form of emergency care assistants, technicians. The list goes on.
It really does.
So we worded it as it was open to operational firefighters and above and beyond, and also to frontline ambulance service staff. So that was really important for us that we got everybody's opinion. And so we decided to exclude the police for now.
Tends to be my go-to approach to most things.
There is method.
I'm joking.
There is method in the madness. So we just felt like.
But they're trained in so many other things. There's too many.
There is.
I'm sure you could have done it for anybody, but there's too many crossovers.
Yeah,
and there's loads of benefit from them participating in when this gets to that iteration as well.
And that's exactly it. And that's what we said. We said, well, based on the scale of this project, and Kat mentioned it earlier. It was a relatively small pilot study. Is how we decided to run it. So Kat was very upfront in telling it's just a master's degree, wasn't it? So let's keep it low key.
Absolutely,
let's not get away from that.
When my kid comes home and says, "Daddy, I've got a Sunday project." Similar level.
Very, very similar. Yeah, very similar. So that's good. So that
hers has got lots of pictures.
Just a shorter time scale.
Just a shorter time scale. That's what we tell ourselves. So that's exactly it. So it's a shorter time scale, and we didn't want to get so much data that we couldn't handle that amount of data. So the plan was always to run it as a pilot project.
But exactly like as Kat was saying, then once you've got a solid understanding of one thing, you can fully, unquestionably stick a nail in it and stand on it, like you say, as a foundation, and go, "We've got this. This is the takeaway. Now we're going to go X." Otherwise, it'd be endless. And then where do you draw that? You've got to have a cut-off somewhere.
Precisely.
It's not against anybody. You've got to have a cut-off.
So coming back to the training element of it, my understanding and my sort of opinion on this is that we run it as a training in awareness. Because
who's going to do that though?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I might well do it.
I think you would be most appropriately placed. People such as yourself.
Would you like to join me?
Similar. There's a few things I'd sincerely like to be on. So every time I sit down with people, and I would like to be part of this, in all honesty, and we're gonna put this stuff in the notes of the pod, so at least we can have. I can morally feel like I'm contributing to it. But there's more people than you would think that do have an interest in contributing to something like this if they can understand the scope of it. Some people say no to things they don't really know what they're saying no to.
Yeah,
you don't fully understand.
It's about getting that information across there, isn't it?
I wasn't going to throw a massive responsibility in your lap and then blame you if it goes wrong.
Yeah,
contribute,
of course.
Get in.
And again, this is where it all comes back to the awareness. There's no expectation, is there? There's no expectation. And one of the things that we haven't really touched upon yet that I think is a really, really important point to make is that when we've talked about getting data from people and asking them to give their opinions, we need to make it really clear that firefighters have a defined role. Emergency service staff have a defined role. And we've always said from the get-go that your number one priority, where it is, should be to save and preserve endangered life. And this doesn't come above that.
It's not going to detract from that.
It's never going to detract from that. And that's really important. And people were really quick to get on board with that. Once they understood that, that's not what this is about. This is about an additional skill. And my hope is that a very small amount of awareness could make a very big difference in the long run.
Absolutely.
And that's what it all really boils down to. So in terms of training, I think it needs to be probably less specific and more general. And I think, like I say, just raising that awareness amongst a crew on a fire engine.
Do you see it manifesting as like and I know I'm not going to hold you down to any of this, but do you see it as like an awareness package that is then delivered to crews for trainers to deliver themselves? Do you see it in like a webinar based thing? How do you think that might manifest? I know the study's still ongoing, so I'm asking a hypothetical question.
Yeah, it's probably too difficult to answer that question. But what I would say in answer to that is that I think there's a lot of ground to cover, and I think it doesn't necessarily matter. I think it's important that the fire service itself decides that. They decide what's best for them. Is it best that we train their staff up and their staff disseminates that information and teaches it, or would they rather have a course that is a rigid course that is booked in on a specific date with a specific training team? And that's up to the fire service, isn't it? And I think that's up to the management to decide what's best for them moving forward. And for a lot of this, I'd like to put that onto the fire service. I'd like to have them work with me and say, well, what do you think is going to work?
That's the best way of collaborating with people, I think, is presenting not problem, but presenting the challenge as a collective, and then allowing them to get some stake in the game and going, how do we've identified this thing, how do you think, we've got several options, how do you think is the best way of going about it? Because you know your staff better than we do, you know how your learning styles are, you know what infrastructure you've currently got in your service to help support that development, rather than us throwing something at you and going, that doesn't really fit into our 36-month plan.
Sure.
What's this got to do with NOG? We need to focus on NOG now. We're getting you're like,
here's a problem, help us with the solution.
And also, I think we need to consider the sort of geographical demographic of this country. For a rural fire service in the northeast of England, they're going to have it's all relative. They're going to have a different demand and want different training.
If you force them to do high-rise training every week, they'll be like, we've got no high buildings. I get that's really important in the middle of London, but we don't live there.
And this is it. And if you went to a really densely populated city, an inner city fire station, they're going to have a different operational response.
And it's also relative to the number of police and or ambulance and or what is the demand placed upon that service versus their skill set. Because like I say, people that live in really rural areas might have greater mountain rescue capacity, and whereas some people have zero awareness. So you're right, the geographical aspect is something you're going to give them that freedom to say, this is something that's beneficial to everybody, you decide in what capacity.
Precisely that, exactly. So that's the way to move forward, I think, personally.
I wanted to ask you both kind of about, because we're speaking about different aspects of how to develop people, and hearing the two of you, Kat, you've been involved in different levels of academia at different parts of your life. James, you've gone from one service to another. There's kind of an underlying aspect of an eternal student. So I kind of wanted to ask you about personal development in general. I've got different ways that I try and plug into it, but how does that look for either of you now, really, in terms of, Kat, you've just said, in your studies in itself, there is no end point. So how do you continue to stay interested in questioning your own biases, developing yourself? What does personal development look like for you at the minute?
That's quite a tricky question, to be honest. It's just that constant, I'm kind of very similar to James. Like, I like to have constant stimulation or changes to the job that I can get, because I have a lot of practical experience as well. Like, after my undergrad and things like that, I did work in labs and in mortuaries and also in higher education. So I was always a science technician for ages. So I have a lot of the practical
I think
skills.
That's a great thing for some people to be involved. And there's a lot of opportunities for people to involve in studies, even like what you're talking about there, James. How much benefit do you think, just as a double click on that there, people can, not easily, but people can more easily access that, and also, I will say, lower level of scientific study. But just from that, they can get a very big development in terms of how people handle data, how tests are done, how you create a clinical study, what does it even mean to do it? How much do you think that initial growth curve can really help people?
It's huge, and it can really, really help. And again, it's that going back to understanding the full process, the full story of what you're looking at. As a scientific professional, you're always learning. You can always find out about other branches of even the same kind of discipline. Yeah. Like I said, forensics is massive, so constantly learn about other areas of forensics, getting to meet people. Like, I go to conferences a lot, present at conferences, and you get to meet lots of different individuals from different walks of life, different countries.
Do they all have PhDs as well? Most, because we don't get invited to those, do we?
What's a PhD?
Yeah, I'm usually doing security out the front or something like that.
They usually have PhDs.
Okay.
No, but it's also very, very open to students and things. So it's all about group learning and this knowledge share and seeing what other bits of research are going on, looking for potential collaborations and things like that. That's
because you said how unique this working relationship is between. How do you think we're not about to dictate to emergency services across the UK, and even if we did demand that they send people to collaborate, it wouldn't be right. We want people to see the benefit in doing it. I imagine, James, is maybe the first one you've interacted with. You say you're early on in your teaching career. Mm-hmm. How much do you think we get enough collaboration? Do you think we should do more? I don't see any negatives from doing it.
There's always scope for more. Yeah. Always scope. And that's what the fantastic thing is, actually, that I found from teaching, is being exposed to people from different disciplines, different kind of occupational backgrounds. So that's why master's level is actually super interesting, because you do get the students that have come all the way through from undergrad and straight into masters, but then you get people like James from a professional background. Yeah. We've had doctors, we've had paramedics.
I suppose it allows you to almost reach out of the deep water of study that you're in and place your finger on the pulse of reality, for want of a better description, and go, this is where I am, let me just, pivot.
Yeah, it gets you to think about things differently.
Yeah. Is what I'm doing going to help you in some way or another? Even if at the minute it seems like a wide gap, well, I can make it a bit of a shorter gap, and maybe I can pivot my study into that ever so slightly. Otherwise, you'll unknowingly do very valuable or very valuable research, but is it actionable? Is it applicable?
It's often very niche.
Yes.
So, we want to be able, there's a big push at the moment in academia about trying to make research that's very practical and
got to serve the end user.
Yeah, but beneficial to society and things like that.
Absolutely.
So not just, like I said before, not just theorising things, but actually making something that can help
What about yourself, James? You've obviously had to sort of unpick your life in one sector. I always think about climbing down the ladder to step over to climb back up. Not that you're all about promotion or anything like that, but just to develop your knowledge base. People thought, I've been in the fire service for 10 years or 3 years or 1 year. I've done all the really hard bit. I've literally just become competent after 2 years, and now I'm going to go and step over there and become green again. Do you know what I mean?
Definitely,
That's a big humility pill to swallow.
Definitely. I think that's a really good analogy to give, and we talked about this before. It's about taking those skills that you've learned with you. You develop skills.
You never really start from zero.
You never start from zero. That's a bit of a misconception. People think that, but you're not starting from zero. And I think we know, don't we, in the industry that we both have worked in and do work in, that it's research that drives development, and it changes policy, it changes guidance, and it's 9 times out of 10 it's for the better.
Absolutely,
no doubt behind that. And of course, with that, not only do we get better policies and better procedures, but we get better training, and we get more CPD and more continuing professional development in a specific area. I think that's really, really important. And definitely in the last 5 years, that's come on, in my experience, leaps and bounds. But one thing...
And right at the beginning of so many of these things as well, there's usually been a massive cost paid. And I don't mean like somebody funding something, forensics. At some point in time, somebody died and they couldn't prove or disprove it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And the cost to that family, the pain that went through for that, Grenfell, contaminations, even just like manual handling. The cost at some point was somebody really hurt themselves and they were out of the job that they loved forever.
That's it.
So at the beginning of so many innovations that some people go, why is this relevant? There's usually a big cost was paid by somebody. And if that was you, you'd be so passionate about changing this as well.
And the trick there, of course, is to bring the two together, bridge the two. Let's try and get in there first. Let's find out where the problem is before the problem happens, and someone pays the ultimate
Somebody
price.
has to pay the price.
And let's get in there first. And I think we're seeing that now more and more. So one thing that I think is really important is we put a lot of emphasis on professional development being some great, big, huge, multidisciplinary exercise with helicopters. But it's not about that. I think it's about, some of the best CPD or the best professional development that I've done in recent times is a 28-minute podcast I've listened to on the drive to work.
Love it, man. And I'm the same, honestly. People, and again, I'll pray and have a bias. I get it. But I am so optimistic about the day when we've got a little tagline that I put on some of the podcasts sometimes. I'm like, learning out loud. We are not experts, but we know people who are. I'm saying that because I'm like, I want to sit down, and every time I do this is a form of professional development for me, 100%. And it doesn't even, sometimes it's even better if it's not in your subject matter. That's why you sit down with somebody like Kat, I feel so valuable, because it's like we said before we came on, they kind of come in under the veil of the emergency services, pop up in the middle of us and go, learn this. And we're like, oh, Jesus. Oh, well, that was so valuable. But we'd have never let them through the door to start with. They'd be like, there's nothing to do with us, Kat, move along.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I just thought it might help. Move along. We don't want to learn your witchcraft. Thank you very much.
And I think the other thing is social media. Social media has its problems. We know that. But if it's used in the right way, so this project, for example, was disseminated through a professional Twitter account, a standalone Twitter account, which was designed and
very powerful tools.
Very, very powerful. If used the right way and used correctly, very, very powerful. But it doesn't always have to be so professional. It doesn't always have to be. There doesn't have to be an agenda. I had someone message me the other day.
I think that's what limits so many things.
Yeah, massively.
Some people that when the podcast first started, they didn't want to come on. That have come on subsequently have been like, no, we're like a professional body. That's kind of popcorn. And I'm like, no, it's really good. People like listen to it and they learn stuff. But if you just need to get over yourself, and like if people get over themselves and engage with social media and the emergency service as a whole, we try and reach our communities, and we're like, it's so hard to reach the community. Well, make it interesting then.
Yeah, this is it. Exactly.
Stop being so dull.
Exactly. And I think, as a society, we're more likely to reach out now. I mean, I have on my Twitter account, the bio is like 2 sentences. I had a paramedic from down south messaged me the other day. We exchanged a couple of messages. That resulted in a 2-hour phone call, about, courses that he'd been on and experience that I've had and what that led to and just discussing contacts more than anything. And I think, CPD, it's often thought of as being very scripted, and it has to meet tick boxes and it has to meet a requirement. But actually, some of the best CPD...
We think if it's not complex, it's not justified. We're like, we need to prove or validate it with somebody. So I sat down and listened to this, or I sat down and watched that. I saw a small infographic. Some of the most powerful things are like an infographic. It's like problem statement, do ABC. And that's what flashcards are.
Of course they are.
Like these quick aid memoirs, or like CX, do Y and Z. Great.
And one of the things I try and do to stay current is I try and at least once a month I try and pick a topic that I've not heard of before. Or I have I don't necessarily have to be interested in that topic necessarily. And the more I read into it, spend an hour reading or listening about it, and it's amazing how much crossover there is. There's always crossover, between my experience or how I can develop that experience down the line, or how I can use some of those skills. So I think it's just about breaking down the barriers and just being open to listen and learn, and even things that seem very abstract. There's usually a link. There's usually a link to it somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can find it.
But media in particular is such an amazing tool for getting across this kind of knowledge about forensics, and again with the Innocence Files, it's questioning forensics, because there's this whole preconception that forensics is infallible, and that if they get DNA on something and that's it, that's end of story, they're guilty, and it's just not true. and there's a lot of interpretation. Even the experts who found the DNA and things like that, there's interpretation involved in that, and there's things like secondary transfer, and like would the DNA be expected to be there? It's about questioning everything.
That's
Consume
great.
Everything.
I absolutely love that. What about yourself, James, when we look at those different ways of learning or different resources?
Definitely. So in terms of reading books, I quite like reading sort of autobiographies, but it's less about the end point for me, and it's more about the journey that person's taken. It's always the case. I end up not being that interested in the sort of the end goal or where the career's ended up. Yeah. It's more about the process they've gone through, and that's where I do most of the learning. It's a hero story. Of course it is.
Do you know what I mean? And that's how, like, you look at Disney and Pixar films, they're all the same story trend. And whenever you hear somebody go through those level of challenges, the underdog, and then they go through the same archetype, you're like, bang, it's so inspiring. The outcome is less important than the journey.
Absolutely
always.
Right. Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be a celebrity, does it?
No.
Everybody I've met ever has got a story of some description, and it's usually that
whole
process.
Point of this thing. I'm like, they haven't got to be a super famous person to be interested. We are surrounded by interesting people in our sector and and in Cat's sector. What we all do, fascinating.
Yeah, and just that journey in general, it's such a, for most people, it's not a straight line, is it? It's convoluted. There's barriers, there's issues, and it's usually getting over those issues and learning about how people have navigated through that journey that I find interesting and that I take most away from.
And learning how to get other people interested. You made a great point there, Kat, about the way that like films or documentaries and stuff communicate stuff can make it really interesting. So then if you've genuinely, sincerely, like yourself, or if you've sincerely got something that is valuable to communicate, well, actually don't turn your nose up at the way that they've communicated it, because if you look at how a lot of social media works and stuff like that, if they can grab your attention and have you so gripped onto something that's promoting spandex trousers or whatever, well, if you could do that with the really interesting, impactful thing that's going to change the world, then learn from it. Don't worry about what they're doing, but how are they doing it? How are they making it so enticing? And that's where I see, us as the emergency services, we need to take those learnings, not turn our nose up at it and think we're better than that, because we've got to come down to that level and engage with people that are just there. That's where the eyeballs are. That's where people are getting those things. So we've spoken a lot about sort of developing ourselves and stuff like that. What are some of the habits and hobbies we've spoken about, sort of documentaries and stuff like that? Has there been any specific habit? And maybe that not be the case. Sometimes this question fails, have you got into any habits about how you go about learning? Is there any habit that's really served you in the last 3 years, James?
I've got into a terrible habit.
Okay.
I'm happy to share with you a terrible habit. So since
that's what the lessons are.
Well, this is what it's all about. So I think going back into education, one of the things I found is my time management in terms of getting into studying, getting my teeth into something and losing 4, 5, 6 hours. And one of the, it's so common for me to end up working at 4 a.m. and realising I've got a meeting at 10 o'clock. And I think Kat's nodding her head. She probably agrees. And when you're passionate about something, it's easy. So the habit for me really is trying to action that and trying to keep a routine, trying to keep a good circadian rhythm, go to bed at a good time, try and get up at a good time. For me, it's just all the small things that build up, that make you more powerful. It took
me ages to realise how much of a performance enhancer sleep is. It's so bad. Because you can't sell it is why it's never really spoken about. When you go to the doctors, and with the greatest respect to doctors, they can sell sleeping medication, they can sell anti-depression, and I'm not saying there's no value in those things, but there's some great books out there if people want to go and learn about it. Sleep. Just general sleep and that discipline, when everything is so important to do and you want to develop yourself and you want to get better and you feel ashamed that you haven't achieved this or that so far. We used to glorify that whole burn the midnight oil. There's pictures of great academics studying until the wee hours of the morning. That's how the breakthroughs were made, and you're like, well, yeah, and then they probably went insane. Their family left them, and all they had was a big, library of study. Do you see that is that kind of a thing? Is it glorified to be working in labs at 3 a.m?
There's a huge push actually at the moment in academia about work-life balance and trying to get that, obviously you're incredibly passionate about what you do, but having a life at the same time, it doesn't have to be separate. It's not one or the other. You can have both.
Especially when what you're going after, people think it's so essential. Like, forensics, or like, we joked about curing cancer, but sort of like, you need to do this. People are dying. Why are you not still at work? Why are you not fixing this problem? And it's like, because I've got to get the balance, otherwise I'm not effective anymore.
Exactly. And there's a lot of pressure all the time in academia. And it is trying to make sure that, if you're a happy worker, a happy person in general, you're going to be a better worker, you can do better research. And at the end of the day, that's what you want. You want happy people doing great research.
Love that. So looking back, James, a bit of a personal reflection. It's not about regrets or anything, but I always like to ask people, thinking back when you first started in the fire service or in the paramedics or in education, is there anything you wish you'd spent more time doing then?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if we go back one step before that, actually, when we talk about school, I think if I'd maybe committed a little bit more at school, in secondary school, I think maybe my route into education would have been less restrictive. It would have been easier. So, I've had to go back and do additional courses to be able to meet the requirements to get into university to do an undergraduate degree, and then that undergraduate degree has led to the master's degree, and it's a process, isn't it? And I sometimes wonder if maybe if I'd applied a little bit more sort of at 15, 16 years of age at secondary school, would that have made the path a little bit easier? But then on reflection, I also enjoyed school, and I think, I had a very, very good time.
Which is a win in itself. And, a lot of people don't enjoy it.
Of course, and I think actually, you can reflect too much sometimes and think actually, well, yes, I could have done this and I could have done that, but ultimately the opportunities are there, and it's still there, and it maybe means you have to work a little bit harder or a couple of extra late nights.
Youth is wasted on the young, and I always think sometimes education and schooling is sometimes wasted. We should obviously, young people should still be learning in that capacity, but we shouldn't make learning so, like you said, about restrictive in that there's only one way to do it, and there's only one way to learn. Some people, we all learn so very differently.
We do, yeah.
What about yourself, Kat? We've said about looking back on the beginning of our careers, but I'd be really interested for somebody that's heard, some of the stuff you've shared today, if they had an appetite for getting into forensics or, just that sector as a whole, is there anything? What would your advice be to someone just going into that sector, or looking back, is there anything you thought, when I started out in this, if I'd have thought about X, Y, or Z, what advice would you give to somebody wanting to start out in that sector?
Specifically, if you're looking for forensics, I would make sure you have a science background. Okay. I super enjoy the practical aspects of forensics. I really like crime scene analysis and things like that. But from an analytical point of view, I'm a little bit rubbish. So if you really are more into the analytical side, you need a grounding in things like chemistry and stuff like that. Okay. I'm quite tactile. I like subjects that I can get my teeth into, and that's why I really enjoy anthropology, because you're literally just like seeing if bones match together and how they feel and things like that. When I started out, I was just super into biology, because that's all squishy. I think a lot of people interesting.
I like it. I did a lot of stuff, even just in the physical training world, anatomy and physiology, and learning how the body works. You've only got one of these vehicles. If you can learn as much as you can about it, I always think, like you say, in and around science, I think people should have a greater understanding of their own anatomy and their own biology, how their body works most efficiently, what we're putting in it, what's most effective, sleep, and all of those things, because the sooner you can learn them, when we talk about longevity, it's going to serve you tenfold.
Exactly. And with forensics, it's because all forensics really is applied science. So it's all these existing techniques and things just applied to a forensic context a lot of the time. So if you want to go into forensics, you need a good grounding in all science. I guess I'm kind of similar to James. I went a bit of a random route into forensics, and
we all did.
And I just knew I liked science, and I liked the more, I guess, gruesome side of things, I guess. But I did unusual A-levels, because I'm also very interested in art and things like that. Yeah. So I didn't really make up my mind for quite a while.
I think there's a really, really interesting crossover as well. Like when you look about art is very relative to the individual. It's very personal. What you think is art to somebody else might be hideous or might be beautiful. But what I see when I think about people that are artists is they see the world in a different way. And if that's not like a core aspect of science and innovation and development, if we all look at it exactly the same way, we're not going to make any progress. It takes somebody to come in and turn it 45 degrees and go, do you see that? And they go, I don't know, I'm standing over here. And you go, oh, have a look at it. And they go, bang.
Yeah.
That's art. If great research isn't a form of art, then I don't know what is.
Exactly. And it's just that, I went a very organic way of getting into the industry that I got into. But I think my biggest advice to anyone would be just do what makes you passionate, what you're interested in. There was a lot of people at the beginning of my journey that were very much like, oh, you shouldn't do that, you're not going to get a job in that, and all those kind of opinions. And I was very stubborn and just like, you know what, I'm just going to do it because I find it really interesting. Yeah. And that's probably my biggest
I think a lot of people give advice and they're not qualified to as well, though. And that sounds horrible, but some people are a little bit reluctant to encourage people to do something because then it will shine a light on the fact that maybe they never went for it. Do you know what I mean? And some people grew up in a different age where academic study wasn't as accessible to them. Education was much more narrow. It was designed to place people into industries that weren't necessarily as accessible as some of the stuff you guys are involved now. So they're coming from a totally different time as well. And when I say they're not qualified to give you advice, it's not because they're not educated, but when I say educated, they're just not experienced in the different ways that you could now go out and apply your resources and apply your knowledge and your passion and your artistic way of looking at the world. You can apply that to so many different things.
It's just a different angle of looking at things, isn't it? Exactly.
Always. I always say there's at least three sides to something. There's my version, your version, and there's the true version. There's always at least three sides to it. James, I wanted to just sort of finish with the elevator pitch of how do we get people, it's going to be in the notes below. Why should people go and do the questionnaire? Why should they contribute to this? How's it going to help us all?
I think the number one reason is because it's real, There's very few opportunities, I think, out there for people to actually give their opinions and talk about their experiences and for that information to have an actual impact on what we're doing. And that's what this is. So this isn't, like you said, it's not theory. It's not going to write a lovely article in a paper and then it's going to disappear. But this is a
very tangible way for you to contribute something. You can see the flow of how this is going to help people on the front line. It's a very much, I can see how this is going to make an impact.
Precisely. And I think, as firefighters, there's a conception in the public. We go to fires and we play a bit of pool in between and all the rest of it. But I think the reality is actually that a lot of the profession is underrepresented, or people don't necessarily know the skill set that firefighters have. And I think it's important that firefighters get a chance to actually say, well, do you know what, actually we do other things, and this is a skill that we can build on and we can assist forensics with,
That's it. My hope is that this encourages people as well to cross over, to use your avenue to cross over into different areas of study and go, hey, did you know I've attended a bunch of this? Or did you know that we do all of this? Would that be of any benefit to you? And I'm sure a number of people may or may not, if they have the time, snap their hand off and go, hell yeah, let's do a 6 month, let's do a 1 year thing.
Absolutely. That's it. Exactly.
Beautiful. Kat, James, thank you so much for taking time out of your valuable research, not curing cancer and not, working on your 5-minute swim badge or whatever it is you're going to, or that master's thing, whatever you're doing. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be here with us. I think it's hopefully going to make a real difference. I say, people, it's still open. You will see it in the notes below on this podcast. Please click through. It'll only take you a few minutes of your time and the impact could be substantial. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it, boys and girls. That was my conversation with James and Kat. Once again, I'm going to reiterate for the final time, in the notes below this episode, you can go and check out the link to the questionnaire. Please do so. If you're still listening to me at this point, then you must have found some of it interesting, even if just me fumbling around the conversation was funny enough to keep you tuned in. Do me that favor. Go on over and fill in the questionnaire that's in the notes. Also, remember, the best way to support the podcast is for checking out the partners. So please do go into the notes. It's really important. Also, if you've enjoyed listening today, click subscribe on the podcast. Maybe even leave us a review if you're listening on a platform that allows you to do so. Jump into the notes below. Get on the email list. Make sure you get all the latest information coming out from the Firefighters Podcast and all of our partners. So all that's left to say is a big thank you for coming back. Thank you for taking time out of your life to be with myself, James, and Kat today. I hope you've taken something away from it. I hope you walk away from this and maybe even discuss it with somebody. Maybe you're even going to go so far as to share it. That would be a big help to us. Share it on your social media platform. Send the link to somebody. Drop it in the WhatsApp group. And until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, stay hungry, and we will see you again real soon right here on the Firefighters Podcast.